So, what can the United States do, or what should it be doing in order to ultimately avoid a war with China? You have to look at this from the perspective of the Ukraine war. American weakness in that scenario led to the war itself. So, American weakness towards providing the Ukrainians weapons emboldened the Russians. Our defeat in Afghanistan emboldened the Russians. The Ukrainians not building up their military or mobilizing it properly helped the Russians. So a lot of these scenarios are ultimately going to play into how the U.S. should approach the China situation, which is China's rise on the world stage. So if you look at this here, what you will be able to see is the geographic area of China. And of course, ultimately surrounded by enemies or people that are not very favorably disposed towards China. You have India, you have Vietnam, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Russia. So a lot of countries that don't have historically good relations with China have fought wars with China. Oh yeah, we have the Philippines and Indonesia on top of that. So a bunch of countries that don't like China for a bunch of different reasons. Well, one of the great failings of our China policy, of course, is economically it's failed. It's allowed a lot of predatory practices to happen from the Chinese side, and you have this fallacy of free trade being equated with anarchic free trade, like there's no rules in the scenario of trading. That's not how it works internationally. That's not how it's supposed to work. But they've gotten away with quite a lot in order to fund our low prices at Walmart, and our current inflation is a marker of just how dependent we have been on them, and that resulted from X's zero COVID policy, basically shutting down work there, and so forth and so on. But the China policy first has to be based on free trade agreements. So when we pulled out of the TPP, which was a trade zone that was going to exclude China, this is in direct opposition to Donald Trump saying it was going to include China. When we pulled out of that deal, we weakened our position vis-a-vis the Chinese, and we weakened our ability to build an alliance around China to deal with the Chinese. What we need instead, we probably need to reconstitute that in some degree, but we also need a free trade agreement between us and the Europeans, because we're so close to the rest of the West now with this rallying around NATO due to the Russian invasion that that should be capitalized on economically and used to strengthen all the countries involved. Because ultimately everyone's going to win in such an arrangement, because you have basically the U.S. and Europe are almost equal economically and as trading blocks. That would be step one, because step one is to economically make sure that that is in order. And you'd want that to be the largest free trade area in the world. So, as a corollary to NATO, there's something called the Partnership for Peace, which sometimes includes countries that are having baby steps toward NATO, like Ukraine famously was part of the Partnership for Peace in 2008. Japan is part of it, just as an association. So we would want to expand that to include India, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, Taiwan. and you would probably want to give them American arms of some sort or another. I mean, we have supplied Saudi Arabia of all countries, which is a very unfriendly country to the United States in a lot of ways, with American weapons. And now you're seeing a discrediting of Russian arms that all these countries use, more or less, with the exception of Taiwan. And it would be a scenario where we could probably give them stuff we don't even need, because of what war are we going to use M1 tanks in any time in the future? You're talking about a naval and an air war in the Pacific if we ever go to war with China, which would be an apocalypse. I mean, for everybody involved. So the next step in this would be the question of Taiwan, because that's where there would likely be a war. Any conflict in the South China Sea, that's much more remote. Them attacking Japan, that's much more remote. They couldn't be that stupid. But an attack on Taiwan is much more likely. And so the question for Taiwan is, what do they want to do? Because a lot of people in the United States do not want to defend Taiwan, and I would say we want to make Taiwan so strong, or we ought to assist Taiwan if they choose to become so strong as to simply deter an attack by China. You're actually talking about the most extensive amphibious operation in human history. So it would dwarf D-Day or anything we ever did in the Pacific. It would probably be probably something on the order of Okinawa. And you don't have. This is just looking at the cold hard facts. You don't have a big window of time to launch an attack on Taiwan in terms of the seasons, because of the storm season and whatnot. You don't have good beaches. You only have a few different areas you can establish a beachhead in. So your better option if you're China is just missiles, aircraft, and ships. Well, we've recently seen what a country without a navy can do to a navy with just missiles. So that would tell me that it would be very easy if, Taiwan wanted to build itself up to defend itself, first of all, to get Taiwan direct aid, you know, anti-ship missiles, anti-air missiles, maybe have a covert program where we can provide them with this type of assistance. So basically, give them lend lease is what I would say, which would be, of course, inherently provocative. But you're looking at a situation where an attack on Taiwan, uh, geostrategically, it's a way for China to get out of the first island chain and into the Pacific. So it's a breakwater. It would be difficult for the United States to really assist Taiwan in fighting the actual war, even if it happened. So the idea ought to be to prevent it from happening in the first place. So you'd want to provide them with whatever we could in terms of those systems, because it doesn't seem like China would want to build up this huge navy and just lose it in a disastrous war. It's using the same equipment that Russia is using. In some cases, it's more advanced, but we've got some of the same problems that exist in the Russian military exist in the Chinese military. In fact, corruption is pretty bad as far as China itself. So that would be how you strengthen Taiwan. You want to make Taiwan impregnable. But there is a section of Taiwan that wants to reunify, which politically the United States shouldn't have a dog in that fight. So your next step, the other power in Asia, if you look down between Malaysia and Indonesia, there's a series of straits called the Malacca Straits. Now, you can easily have, I mean, you very easily have one of those minor countries go against China. Some of them are more friendly towards the United States. But ultimately, It wouldn't take much for the Indian Navy to be able to control those straits. So the question is how you turn that Quad alliance, which is formed, into more of a deterrent alliance to keep China from becoming an aggressive power. Because frankly, China, along with most countries, is going to be able to do more through peaceful means than it would through war. It hasn't been a country that's fought a lot of successful wars in the in its recent history, and it has accomplished far more in terms of its recovery through minding its own business and developing economically than attacking any of its neighbors. And then you have what I would say would be corollary situations or corollaries to this. China's allies internationally are really Russia, which could be dismantled. I mean, I'm going to describe that in a future video on how to dismantle the Russians. Then you have Iran and North Korea. Now, when I personally look at this is just a question, but when I look at North Korea's position vis-a-vis the DMZ, let me see if I can get this to go. There we are. All right. Most people are going to know what I'm talking about, but I want to see the map. All right. So when you look here, this demilitarized zone is very close to Seoul. And one of two questions come to mind. The first question is, why did the South Koreans not move the capital further south? And the next question is, if they're not going to move it, why has the United States not sought to move the DMZ northward enough that Seoul is outside of artillery range? So, I mean, if they're supplying shells to Russia to fire in the Ukraine war and depleting their own stocks, which are established on the DMZ to ostensibly shell Seoul in a terroristic response to a war, then you might want to ask the North Koreans, you know, why don't they do that? Why don't they move it north by 100 kilometers or so? And maybe the South Koreans want to move the border 100 kilometers or so. Then you look at the other ally. Just disentangling Russia would be a whole different ball game. It's not that complicated, but it's very risky. All these things I'm talking about are very risky foreign policy moves. So the other ally in the region would be Iran. But recently, there's been some interesting developments in Iran, uh, and also developments within Saudi Arabia, where they kind of stabbed the United States in the back. So you may want to use Iran as a regional counterbalance against Saudi Arabia as a bugaboo to say, hey, this is what happens when you don't support us. We're going to let Iran eat you, basically. There's a lot of different things you can do there. The one country that really cares about Iranian nuclear weapons is not the United States. Okay, the Iranians do not have a working relationship with Salafi terrorists who have attacked the United States repeatedly. Iran has not effectively commanded direct attacks on the United States. They may have been involved in some very sketchy assassinations that we definitely should respond to. But those Iranian nuclear weapons are not a threat to the United States. Clearly, our nuclear arsenal is second only to Russia, and probably, honestly, judging by Russia's inability to even operate tanks properly, definitely superior to the Russians in terms of command, control, and technology. So we don't give a shit about Iran's little Shahid or Shahir, whatever the hell they want to call them, the Bashar, Isfahan, I don't know. What do they call their ballistic missile that can reach Turkey or Israel? Israel cares, right? Erdogan might care about nuclear weapons in Iran. So maybe we tell the Israelis, if you're really worried about it, bomb it. You know, do what you got to do. and we won't have a hand in it. That's been talked about for years. Of course, you have Iranian nuclear scientists that are mysteriously dying. You have incidents like Stuxnet, where the programmable logic controllers, which were Siemens brand, I believe, were overloaded, sending false all clear signals to the operators who were watching for alerts, and spun the centrifuges around enough that they were melting. Okay, so very vicious type of cyber attack that let something very nefarious out of the box that we've not been able to put back inside. So ultimately, Chinese alliances are very, very poor. Okay, you have a country that Russia is its primary, probably its strongest ally, and they're a disaster. They're a joke. They've just been subjected to the Winter War sequel in Ukraine. You have North Korea, who is the ultimate rogue state, and you have Iran. So you don't have a lot of very strong functional countries that are aligned with China, nor a lot of countries that are tripping over themselves to become so. So ultimately, you want to get around this problem of having to defend Taiwan by making it impregnable. You want to make sure there's no conflict in the South China Sea, and you want to make an ally out of every country you can in an arc running from India to Japan. So, and then you want to dismantle all of their allies, which would benefit the United States, and you also want to strengthen our position economically. Admittedly, some of this is already happening. You already have production moving to places like Vietnam because of labor costs in China going up. But this is what I believe the United States should have done years ago. Um, Trump's rhetoric about China was meaningless. The tariffs were meaningless. They did nothing. They benefited no one. You want to talk about why inflation happens? Look at the goddamn tariffs. So, because ultimately to bring prices down, you want a smooth supply chain. That's it. If it starts in China and ends up here, you want a smooth supply chain. You don't want barriers. You don't want a crazy COVID lockdown, a zero COVID policy, mind you, that Xi is pursuing. So ultimately, I have my own biases. I had a Tibetan home health worker take care of my mom when I was younger, so I heard the worst of what the Han Chinese would do to minorities, even before the Uyghurs became a big thing. And yes, I'm aware of the feudal nature of Tibetan society prior to the Chinese occupation, but that's neither here nor there. So ultimately, the scenario that you want to happen would be some kind of liberalization of China. I'm not saying they have to look like the United States. Nobody wants that. We've got our own problems, right? But a China that was less authoritarian and less focused on these international acts meant to undo the century of humiliation. I do think that if you had a Chinese republic, it would have some of the same impulses that the PRC does, but it would probably have more good faith internationally to pursue those without resorting to just seizing people's territory and extraction of resources and all that. Because I think that there are economic realities that are going to kneecap China from suppressing the United States. I don't even think we can say where the Chinese economy is in terms of gross domestic product. It could be 30% lower, 30% higher. We have no clue. Okay, it's every province is pulling a Stalinism and massively overstating its everything, right? Which, as an investor, I have never really touched China, right? That's their banking system is so opaque and not responsive to regulation or international oversight that putting money there is pretty crazy. It's people just trying to make a quick buck. So, but ultimately, we will need those free trade deals because free trade does improve the lives of everybody involved. When you look at people who criticize free trade, it's always people who don't believe in the stock market, who don't understand the concept of the GDP growing every year and what that means for the supply of jobs and goods and services. It's not a finite number of jobs we have. We are adding jobs. It's not a finite number of dollars that are getting salaries that are getting handed out to people. So when you have Pedro come in and cut your lawn, um, you know, he's not stealing that job from someone else who can easily just go do it as well. So as there are more lawns, there are more people that would want to cut them, right? And I've never known a person who had a serious economic or business background who believed any of that crap about us needing protectionist barriers and yada yada. It's always somebody with a STEM degree who read an article online and thinks that you know what I mean. It's just it's not how it is. But I believe that's how you would achieve peace in Asia ultimately. And the ultimate scenario for all this is these countries liberalize and you have a new international order and maybe you have something like the end of history which Fukuyama talked about, but it's actually true.